A driver noticed that the elderly woman always screamed when her son-in-law entered her room and decided to install a hidden camera. When he showed the recording to her daughter, he was terrified by the reaction. James parked the black executive sedan at the entrance of the imposing Fernandez mansion, as he had done every Tuesday and Thursday for 8 years. The morning sun beat down hard on the polished hood, creating golden reflections that danced through the impeccable garden. He adjusted the rearview mirror and checked the clock on the dashboard. 9 o'clock sharp, as always. Mrs. Margaret's medical appointment was scheduled for 10, with the city's best cardiologist, an appointment that had been scheduled 3 weeks ago. James knew every detail of that house's routine, every schedule, every appointment, every medication his employer needed to take. At 52 years old, he wasn't just a private driver. He was the confidant, the friend, sometimes the only smile Mrs. Margaret saw for entire days. The car was impeccable as she liked it, with the soft scent of lavender that always calmed her during trips. Today will be a quiet day, he thought, as he took the keys. Little did he know that morning would change everything. As soon as he opened the car door, a disturbing sound cut through the quiet morning air. It was a scream coming from inside the mansion, followed by desperate crying. James had known that voice for years. It was Mrs. Margaret, and she was in distress. It wasn't the first time this had happened when Frederick was home, he noticed with growing concern. The son-in-law appeared increasingly frequently in recent months, always with papers to sign, always in a hurry, always leaving the elderly woman in tears. James quickened his pace along the garden stone path, his heart beginning to race with worry. The screams grew louder as he approached the front door, now mixed with an agitated male voice he immediately recognized. "Please don't force me." He heard Mrs. Margaret's frail voice echo through the house. His hands trembled as he turned the handle of the front door. The entrance hall was plunged in strange darkness for that time of day, heavy curtains blocking the natural light that normally flooded the environment. James stopped for a second, his eyes adjusting to the darkness while sounds of argument came from upstairs. It was Frederick shouting, his deep voice reverberating through the marble walls of the staircase. James climbed the steps quickly, his heart beating hard in his chest, his legs heavy with apprehension. With each step, the voices became clearer, more worrying, and he could distinguish the words now. Frederick was demanding something, pressuring, insisting aggressively. The house that James knew so well, where he had worked for so many years, suddenly seemed different, charged with a tension he had never felt before. "You're going to sign this today, even if it's the last thing you do." Frederick's voice echoed through the corridor. James felt a chill run down his spine. The second-floor corridor stretched before him, the closed doors on each side guarding the heavy silence that followed the scream. James advanced quickly, his steps muffled by the thick carpet, heading toward the master bedroom at the end of the corridor. The door was ajar, a weak beam of light escaping through the gap, along with the sound of muffled sobs. He could hear Mrs. Margaret crying softly now, that kind of crying from someone who is afraid and feels cornered. James took a deep breath, mentally preparing to intervene, when the door suddenly opened. Frederick appeared in front of him, tall, imposing, his face red and sweaty, quickly putting something in his jacket pocket. The two men stared at each other for a tense moment, the air heavy between them. "What are you doing here?" Frederick asked, his voice loaded with irritation. James maintained the professional composure that years of experience had taught him. "I came to get Mrs. Margaret for the medical appointment, Mr. Frederick," James replied with a firm voice, trying to look over the son-in-law's shoulder to see inside the room. Frederick moved to block his view, closing the door behind him with a brusque movement. The man adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture that James immediately noticed, and ran his hand through his hair, messing up his previously impeccable hairstyle. There was something strange in his eyes, an agitation that James had never seen before, as if he had been caught doing something wrong. The corridor fell silent for a few seconds, only the muffled sound of Mrs. Margaret's crying could be heard coming from the room. James took a step forward, determined to see his employer and friend. "I cancelled the doctor." "She's not well enough to go out," Frederick said quickly, positioning himself firmly in front of the door. The tension between the two men was palpable. "But, Mr. Frederick, this appointment was scheduled 3 weeks ago. It's very important for her health," James insisted. noticing how Frederick's hands trembled slightly as he buttoned and unbuttoned his jacket repeatedly. The son-in-law looked at the gold watch on his wrist, an impatient gesture, as if he had some urgent appointment. His eyes nervously shifted to the stairs, then to James, then to the room door, in a frenzied dance of anxiety. James knew human behavior well after so many years dealing with people, and all the signs indicated that Frederick was hiding something serious. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable, broken only by the increasingly weak sobs coming from the room. "My mother-in-law won't need your service. You don't need to bother her. I need to go to the backyard to make an important call. The signal doesn't work inside here," Frederick said abruptly, already moving away toward the stairs. James watched every movement of his with redoubled attention. Frederick went down the stairs with hurried and heavy steps, like someone in a hurry to get out of an uncomfortable situation. James waited until he heard the back door close forcefully, the sound echoing through the now silent house, before finally pushing the room door open. The scene he found made his heart tighten with worry. Mrs. Margaret was lying on the canopy bed, looking very small and frail among the white silk sheets. Her face was extremely pale, almost colorless, a drastic change from the vivacious lady he knew. Her white hair, always so well arranged, was disheveled and damp with sweat. But what most alarmed James were the visible signs on the elderly woman's skin, something that revealed what might have been happening to Mrs. Margaret recently. "Mrs. Margaret?" he called softly, approaching the bed carefully. She opened her eyes slowly, with visible difficulty. "James, help me." Her voice came out weak, almost inaudible, but loaded with an urgency that made the driver's heart race. He knelt beside the bed, gently taking her hand in his, immediately noticing how cold and damp it was. Mrs. Margaret's eyes, normally so expressive and alert, were different. Her pupils seemed larger than normal, unfocused. James noticed she was breathing irregularly, shallow, as if each breath required tremendous effort. There was a half-full glass of water on the nightstand, and James noticed a strange residue at the bottom, something that shouldn't be there. Several medicine bottles he didn't recognize were scattered on the table, none with the labels of Mrs. Margaret's usual medications. "What happened, ma'am? How can I help?" James asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the growing panic. "Mrs." Margaret tried to respond but could only moan weakly. James looked around the room, his mind working quickly to assess the situation. His years of experience with security before becoming a driver had taught him to always be prepared. He always carried a micro camera in his pocket, an old habit he maintained as a precaution. Deciding he needed to document what was happening, especially after Frederick's strange behavior, James discreetly pulled out the small device. While holding Mrs. Margaret's hand with one hand, offering comfort, he quickly installed the camera in the base of the lamp with the other. The device was tiny, practically invisible, and would start recording automatically. If something strange was happening in that house, now there would be evidence. "Ma'am, I'm going to call for help," he said, reaching for his phone in his pocket. But when checking the screen, he saw there was no signal to make the call. Before he could try to find another way to make the call, Mrs. Margaret had a sudden reaction that deeply alarmed him. Suddenly, Mrs. Margaret showed severe signs of distress, struggling to breathe and leaving James in panic. The driver immediately dropped the phone, the device falling onto the rug, and carefully held her shoulders. He helped her lie down again, noticing that her face was becoming even paler, her lips losing color. Placing his ear close to her face, James realized she had stopped breathing. His first aid training, done years ago but never forgotten, took control. He quickly checked her pulse at her neck. It was very weak, almost imperceptible. "Don't worry, Mrs. Margaret, I'm going to help," he said, more to himself than to her, while positioning his hands over her chest. He began chest compressions, counting aloud to maintain the correct rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. James counted methodically while pressing Mrs. Margaret's chest with care but firmness. He knew he needed to maintain a constant rhythm, neither too fast nor too slow to be effective. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, he continued, sweat beginning to form on his forehead from the effort and tension of the moment. After 30 compressions, he stopped to gently tilt her head back, opened her mouth and prepared to give mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. It was a procedure he had practiced on dummies during training, but never on a real person, much less someone he considered family. He covered her mouth with his and blew air into her lungs, once, twice. "Please, Mom, come back," he murmured before resuming compressions. The silence of the room was broken only by the rhythmic sound of his work. 30 more compressions, 2 more rescue breaths. James was completely focused now, his entire being concentrated on saving Mrs. Margaret. His hands were beginning to hurt from the repetitive effort, but he ignored the discomfort. Her face remained colorless, eyes closed, body inert under his hands. He continued the cycle of compressions and breaths, his determination unshakable, despite the fatigue beginning to set in. "You're strong, Mrs. Margaret, I know you can do it," he said, his voice choked with emotion. He prepared to give 2 more rescue breaths. James again tilted Mrs. Margaret's head and covered her mouth with his, ready to blow more air into her lungs. The moment their lips touched and he began to blow, something unexpected happened. He felt a strange and artificial taste, something that reminded him of bitter medicine, followed by an uncomfortable sensation that indicated something very wrong. The taste was intense, medicinal, definitely not natural. He tried to pull away quickly, but had already inhaled some of the substance. Immediately, his tongue began to tingle strangely. Then the sensation changed to numbness, spreading rapidly through the inside of his mouth. James pulled away, coughing, trying to spit, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. But the taste persisted, penetrating and worrying. "What is this?" he thought, alarmed, as his eyes began to water. His vision became slightly blurred, and the room seemed to sway gently. Understanding hit James like a cold wave. There was something very wrong with Mrs. Margaret, something beyond a heart problem. The chemical taste, the growing numbness in his mouth, her symptoms, everything pointed to a terrible conclusion. But he couldn't stop now, not when her life depended on his actions. His hands trembled as he returned to chest compressions, but the movements were becoming uncoordinated. The numbness was spreading from his mouth to his throat, making it difficult to swallow. Each compression required more effort than the previous one, as if his muscles were getting weaker. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with tears he didn't realize he was shedding. His own heart began to beat irregularly, sometimes speeding up, sometimes slowing down. "Hold on, Mum," he said with difficulty, the words coming out slurred. The situation was quickly getting out of his control. James's vision continued to deteriorate, the edges darkening as if someone was gradually dimming the room's lights. He persisted with the compressions, but now it was more through determination than proper technique, each movement guided by the silent promise he had made to himself to protect Mrs. Margaret. His hands seemed distant, as if they belonged to someone else, but he forced them to continue through pure willpower. The room seemed to pulse gently, the walls expanding and contracting in a hypnotic rhythm that tried to distract him from his mission. Mrs. Margaret's pale face floated in his blurred vision, too serene, too quiet, and this apparent tranquility scared him more than any scream could. James shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but the movement only intensified the dizziness that threatened to knock him down. He could hear his own breathing, heavy and labored, fighting against the numbness descending down his throat. "I can't give up," he repeated to himself, forcing his hands to continue. Every second seemed like an hour, every movement a mountain to climb, but he would keep climbing for her. "Mrs. Margaret was always so good to me," James thought while maintaining the rhythm of compressions, her memory giving him strength when his body wanted to give up. He remembered his first day of work 8 years ago, when she received him with a warm smile and said he would be part of the family. Since then, she never treated him as just an employee, always asking about his life, remembering his children's birthdays, worrying when he seemed tired. "You can't leave like this, ma'am," he murmured, the words coming out slurred but loaded with emotion. How many times had she insisted that he lunch with her when she was alone? How many conversations had they shared during long trips to the doctor? She trusted him with her fears, her joys, her concerns about the family. "I promised to take care of you," he thought, the unspoken but always present promise echoing in his mind. It was more than a job, it always was, and now when she needed him most, he couldn't fail. Memories flowed through James's mind like a river, each one strengthening his determination even as his body weakened. He remembered how Mrs. Margaret had cried on his shoulder when her husband died 5 years ago, how she trusted him to take her to the cemetery every week in the first months. "You are a good man, James," she always said, "just like you." Those words echoed now in his clouded mind, a beacon in the growing darkness. He thought of all the times he had noticed Frederick being rude to her, all the discussions about money he had witnessed unintentionally, all the visits that became increasingly frequent and more tense. The signs were there. He simply hadn't connected the dots. "I should have done something before," guilt weighed on his heart, but there was no time for regrets now. The important thing was to save her. That was all that mattered. "Come on, Mom, fight with me," he pleaded mentally, his hands continuing the work even when everything else wanted to stop. She had fought for so much in life, survived so many losses. She couldn't end like this. 8 years of trust can't end today, James repeated mentally like a mantra, using the words to maintain focus while everything around him dissolved. He thought of all the mornings he arrived, and she was already at the window waiting, waving with that gentle smile that brightened the day. How she always worried if he drove safely in the rain. How she kept his favorite sweets in the glove compartment for long trips. "How you still have so much to live for," he whispered, remembering how she spoke enthusiastically about seeing her grandchildren grow up, about plans to travel to the beach house next summer. Frederick didn't have the right to take that from her, nobody did. The anger mixed with determination gave James new breath, even if small. "I won't let him win," he promised silently. Each compression was an act of rebellion against what Frederick had done, each movement a declaration that good would defeat evil. James thought of his own mother, who had passed 3 years ago, and how Mrs. Margaret consoled him during that difficult period. "Your mother was lucky to have a son like you," she had said, holding his hands while he cried in the car after the funeral. Since then, she had filled some of that maternal void in his life, always with a kind word, wise advice, genuine concern. "I can't lose another mother," the thought crossed his mind like lightning, giving him renewed strength. His hands found a new rhythm, more determined, more focused. He visualized Mrs. Margaret waking up, smiling, thanking him for saving her. He visualized her confronting Frederick, regaining control of her life, living many more years. "This is going to happen," he told himself with conviction. It wasn't just hope, it was a certainty he refused to abandon, no matter how much circumstances said otherwise. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. James recited mentally the sequence he had learned, trying to use the technical knowledge to anchor his drifting mind. But the numbers got mixed up, got lost, came back different. Precision didn't matter now, continuing mattered. He thought of all the moments when Mrs. Margaret demonstrated her strength, when she lost her husband, when she faced illness 2 years ago, when she recovered from difficult surgery. "If you manage to get through all that, you can get through this too," he affirmed mentally, transferring his faith in her strength to his tired hands. He remembered how she always said God had a plan for everyone, that nothing happened by chance. "Then there must be a purpose for me being here now," he reasoned, finding meaning in the midst of chaos. Maybe his whole life had led to this moment, all his experience, all his training, preparing him to save this extraordinary woman. The tears James didn't realize he was shedding mixed with the sweat on his face as he continued his desperate work. They weren't tears of defeat, but of determination mixed with genuine love for this woman who meant so much to him. "Please, God, if you're listening, save her," he prayed silently, something he hadn't done in years. "She doesn't deserve this. She's a good person, generous, kind." He thought of all the charities she supported, how she treated all employees with respect and dignity, how she never let anyone leave her house hungry. The world needs people like her, he argued with the universe, as if he could negotiate with fate. His hands kept moving, each compression a physical prayer, each movement a plea for mercy. "Take me if you need to, but let her live," he offered in silent desperation, truly willing to trade his life for hers. "I know you're fighting in there," James spoke with difficulty, addressing Mrs. Margaret directly, even without knowing if she could hear him. "You were always a fighter, don't stop now." He remembered all the stories she told about her youth, about how she overcame poverty, built a life, raised children, faced prejudice. "You taught me that giving up is never an option," he continued, using her own words as fuel to continue. How many times had she encouraged him when he thought of quitting work because of financial difficulties? How many times had she raised his salary without him asking, simply because she realized he was going through hardships? "Now it's my turn not to give up on you," he promised, his hands finding strength somewhere deep within himself. The gratitude he felt for everything she had done overflowed in each movement. Each compression was a silent thank you for years of kindness. James felt the exact moment when Mrs. Margaret's heart started beating again under his hands, a small tremor that meant everything. It was like watching the sunrise after the longest night of his life, each beat a promise that not everything was lost. She coughed weakly, the sweetest sound he had ever heard, and her chest began to rise and fall in shallow but constant breaths. The tears streaming down James's face were of pure relief, each one carrying the weight of the terrible fear he had felt in the interminable minutes when she was without breathing. He held her hand with infinite delicacy, as if it were made of crystal, feeling the weak but stubbornly present pulse under his fingers. He remembered all the times she had held his hand in difficult moments, when his mother died, when his youngest son had to have surgery, always present with her maternal affection. "You came back, thank God," he murmured, his voice choked. But even in this moment of deep gratitude, urgency returned like a wave. The bitter taste still burned in his mouth, reminding him of the imminent danger. The dizziness that had started gently now intensified, and James knew he needed to act quickly before becoming too incapacitated to help Mrs. Margaret. He stood up with effort, each movement calculated not to lose balance, and began the long journey to the suite bathroom. His thoughts went to all the years working in that house. How many times he had walked that same path, carrying medicines for Mrs. Margaret when she had the flu, or bringing tea when she couldn't sleep. He never imagined that one day he would be struggling to reach the same bathroom to save both their lives. The walls seemed to move gently, but he concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other, his hand always touching something solid for support. Upon finally reaching the elegant bathroom, with its Italian marble that Mrs. Margaret was so proud of, James did what he needed to do. Between the difficult moments, he kept his mind focused on her, alone, vulnerable, needing him more than ever. "Hold on, Mum," he murmured between waves of nausea. "I'll be right back to take care of you." After what seemed like an eternity, he washed his face repeatedly, the cold water helping to minimally clear his clouded thoughts. Upon returning to the room, each step a small victory against the growing weakness, James found Mrs. Margaret still unconscious, but breathing more regularly. The relief of seeing her alive was always renewed, but now came the difficult part: how to help her eliminate the substance from her system when she was completely inert. He knelt beside the bed, observing her pale face, and remembered all the conversations they had about health, about the medicines she took, about how she was always careful with anything she ingested. "You were always so careful," he thought bitterly, and still Frederick managed to do this. With still trembling hands, he tried gently to make her sit up, supporting her back against his own chest, his body serving as support for hers. It was like holding a rag doll without any stiffness, no response. He tried to gently open her mouth, but there was no reflex, no involuntary cooperation that could help in the process. Frustration grew with each failed attempt, time passing like sand through fingers. "I need to think of something else," he told himself, forcing his mind to work through the chemical fog. It was then that James remembered the cell phone in his pocket, the connection to the outside world, salvation in the form of technology. With fingers that didn't seem to be entirely his, he managed to get the device, the screen lighting up with the photo of his 3 children, Sophie, Harry and Christopher, all smiling in that photo taken last Christmas at Mrs. Margaret's house. She had insisted on making dinner for his family, saying that an employee who was family deserved to be treated as such. The memory brought new determination as he tried to dial the emergency number. But the screen showed the cruel message: no signal. He moved around the room, trying different points, even going to the window where the signal was usually stronger, raising the phone, changing position, but nothing. Frederick told the truth about this, he thought with a mixture of frustration and suspicion. Was it coincidence or part of a bigger plan? He looked at Mrs. Margaret, still unconscious on the bed, and made a decision. "The kitchen," he murmured to himself. "There must be something in the kitchen that can help." James went down the stairs holding firmly to the polished wooden banister, the same one Mrs. Margaret had renovated 2 years ago, after the old one began to creak. She always took care of every detail of the house, keeping everything in perfect condition, creating a welcoming home even after her husband's death. The kitchen was the heart of the house, where she spent mornings having coffee and reading the newspaper, where they talked about life while he waited to take her to appointments. Now that familiar space seemed different, distorted by urgency and the effect of the substance on his system. He opened cabinets with frantic but careful movements, looking for milk. He had always heard that milk helped in cases of poisoning. He found a jar in the refrigerator still half full, and also took a bottle of filtered water. He remembered how Mrs. Margaret was specific about water, always filtered, always fresh, a lifelong habit. "I'm going to save her with the very things she loves," he thought as he climbed back up, each step a mountain but determination propelling him forward. Upon entering the room carrying the liquids like precious treasures, James was surprised to see Mrs. Margaret moving, weakly trying to sit up. His heart raced with hope as he ran to support her, dropping everything on the nightstand with a tinkle of glass against wood. "Easy, ma'am. Slowly. I'm here," he said softly, holding her by the shoulders so she wouldn't fall. Her eyes were open but unfocused, wandering around the room without really seeing, like someone waking from a nightmare without knowing where they are. James took the water glass first, remembering how she always drank water in small sips in the morning, saying it was better for the body. "Small sips, ma'am, as you always do," he instructed gently, bringing the glass to her lips. She managed to drink a little, the liquid going down with difficulty before starting to cough. It was then that it happened. Her body finally reacted, leaning forward as she expelled a clear liquid, the toxic substance being eliminated. "That's right, very good," James encouraged, holding her carefully. When she finished, something changed in her eyes. Mrs. Margaret suddenly grabbed James's arm with a strength that surprised him, her thin but determined fingers digging into his sleeve. Her eyes, moments before unfocused and confused, now shone with urgent lucidity, as if a curtain had suddenly been lifted from her consciousness. She pulled him close, so close he could feel her irregular breathing on his face, and whispered with a hoarse but clear voice, "Frederick's drawer has more." The effort of speaking seemed to drain her strength, but she fought to continue, raising her trembling arm and pointing upward, toward the second floor where Frederick's office was. James felt a chill run down his spine. If there was more substance hidden, this meant it wasn't an isolated incident, but something planned, premeditated, cruel beyond comprehension. Before he could ask any question, Mrs. Margaret fainted again, her hand falling inert. He positioned her carefully on her side, remembering the first aid course instructions about safety position, making sure she was breathing well. "I'm going to find out everything, Mum," he promised before heading to the stairs. Each step toward Frederick's office was heavy with the gravity of what he might find. James knew that house like the palm of his hand, had walked those corridors thousands of times in 8 years, but had never entered Frederick's office without express permission. It was the only place in the house that remained closed, the private sanctuary of the son-in-law that Mrs. Margaret respected, even though she owned the house. Respect he doesn't deserve, James thought with growing bitterness. The dark mahogany door was closed as always, but he knew where the spare key was. In the artificial plant vase beside it, a secret Mrs. Margaret had shared once when she needed him to get important documents. His hands trembled so much he almost dropped the key, the small metal object seeming to weigh tons. "What will I find in there?" he questioned himself as he turned the key. The lock gave way with a click that sounded like thunder in the silent corridor. The office was exactly as James had imagined. Pretentious, dark, full of books that probably had never been opened, framed diplomas on the wall that looked more like decoration than real achievements. But it was the half-open drawer of the desk that immediately captured his attention, as if it were screaming to be investigated. Frederick had left in a hurry, careless enough not to lock everything. James approached with his heart racing, each step echoing on the wooden floor. Upon opening the drawer, he found clear evidence that something very wrong was happening. Suspicious bottles and even an object prepared for use, methodically organized in a velvet-lined wooden box. It was a macabre collection, each bottle a potential dose of suffering for Mrs. Margaret. "How long has this been happening?" he wondered in horror, remembering all the times in recent months that Mrs. Margaret seemed confused, disoriented, weak. How many times had Frederick administered these doses? How many documents had she signed without knowing? But the worst was yet to come. Beside the bottles, shining under the light coming through the window like a malignant object, was a syringe already prepared. The transparent liquid inside seemed innocent to untrained eyes, but James now knew better. It was the next dose already measured, already ready, waiting only for the opportunity. The implication was terrifying in its cruel simplicity. Frederick had no intention of stopping. This morning was just another step in a bigger plan. Beside the syringe was a small black-covered notebook, and James couldn't resist the need to open it. Frederick's meticulous handwriting filled the pages with detailed annotations. Dates, times, dosages, and most disturbing observations about Mrs. Margaret's behavior. More docile today, read an entry from 2 weeks ago. Signed the transfer without questioning, said another from just 3 days before. James felt tears burn his eyes. It was a diary of slow torture, documented with the cold precision of a scientific experiment. I need to document all of this, James thought immediately, his mind clear despite the substance still in his system. He took his phone and began photographing frantically. The bottles, the syringe, each page of that damned notebook. His hands trembled so much that several photos came out blurred, but he persisted, knowing that each image was protection for Mrs. Margaret, proof of the heinous crime being committed. While photographing, his mind wandered to all the times he had noticed Frederick being impatient with Mrs. Margaret, all the discussions about money he had witnessed unintentionally, all the visits that became increasingly frequent and tense. The signs were there, he simply hadn't connected the dots. I should have noticed, he blamed himself, although he knew the blame was entirely Frederick's. An entry in the notebook caught his attention. Dorothy can't know. So Mrs. Margaret's own daughter was being deceived too. James was so absorbed in documenting the evidence, trying to capture every detail with the phone camera, that the sound of the front door opening downstairs caught him completely by surprise. The noise echoed through the silent house like a shot, making his heart race in panic. Frederick had returned earlier than expected. The initial fear quickly transformed into desperate action. He tried to put everything back exactly as it was, but his hands trembled too much, coordination compromised by the substance still running through his veins. The bottles clinked against each other as he tried to organize them, the sound seeming deafening in the office silence. The footsteps began climbing the stairs, 2 at a time, hurried, determined. Frederick was in a hurry, perhaps suspecting something was wrong. James managed to close the drawer, but the syringe was still in his hand, slippery with sweat. "Put it away," his mind screamed, but his fingers didn't obey properly. The footsteps were in the corridor now, quickly approaching the office. James tried to put the syringe back, but it slipped, falling on the table with a small clink. There was no time to leave, nowhere to hide in the Spartan office. All he could do was stay where he was, the phone with the evidence secure firmly in his pocket, and face what would come. The handle turned, the door opened, and Frederick appeared in the entrance. For a moment that seemed eternal, the two men stared at each other, time suspended between them. James could see the process of understanding pass through Frederick's face like a storm forming. First surprise at seeing James there, then his gaze sweeping the room and noting the poorly closed drawer, the syringe on the table, and finally settling on James, clearly debilitated, clearly affected by the substance. Surprise gave way to understanding, and understanding transformed into pure, raw fury. Frederick closed the door behind him with a controlled movement that was more threatening than any slam could be. The click of the lock sounded final, definitive, like the closing of a coffin lid. James observed every movement of the son-in-law, noticing how he turned the key deliberately slowly, as if he wanted James to hear every small mechanism of the lock fitting together. His eyes never left James during the entire process, 2 dark points of contained fury that seemed to see through him. Frederick put the key in his jacket pocket with the same meticulous care, each gesture calculated to demonstrate absolute control of the situation. He took a step into the office, the Italian shoe making a soft sound against the wooden floor, then another moving with the caution of a predator assessing wounded prey. James tried to maintain an upright posture, years of professional dignity fighting against the weakness that threatened to knock him down. He could feel his legs trembling, not just from the substance still running through his veins, but from the crushing gravity of the situation he found himself in, alone, debilitated, locked with a man who had tried to murder his own mother-in-law. Stay calm, he told himself mentally. You've faced difficult situations before. The air between them was charged with electricity, dense and heavy like the moments before lightning strikes during a summer storm. James could almost feel the static in the air, each breath difficult to pull into his lungs. Frederick continued his slow, studied approach, his eyes scanning the office and cataloguing everything out of place. The drawer that wasn't completely aligned, the syringe on the table that should have been stored, the notebook slightly displaced from its original position. It was the look of someone who knew every millimeter of that space and instantly noticed any alteration. James saw Frederick's jaw contract when his eyes landed on the syringe, a muscle jumping in his cheek like a small spasm of anger. The son-in-law's shoulders were tense under his expensive jacket, the posture of someone ready to explode, but holding on by a thread. Frederick stopped a few meters away, close enough for James to smell his expensive cologne mixed with something else, nervous sweat perhaps, or the acrid odor of fear disguised as anger. His fists opened and closed repeatedly, the only visible external sign of the storm happening inside him. The silence stretched between them like a rubber band about to snap, each second adding more tension to the moment. James could hear his own breathing, still irregular from the effects of the substance, and the tick-tock of the antique clock on the wall that Mrs. Margaret had inherited from her father. They were the only sounds in the office, creating a bizarre symphony of anticipation and fear. Frederick slightly tilted his head, studying James like a scientist would study an experiment gone wrong, his eyes narrowed in calculating slits. James maintained eye contact, knowing that looking away now would be seen as weakness, as admission of guilt. It was a silent duel of wills, two men measuring each other, calculating possibilities, anticipating movements. "You shouldn't be here," Frederick finally said, his voice low and controlled but loaded with a threat that made James feel a chill run down his entire spine like icy fingers. Each word was pronounced with surgical precision, paused, deliberate, making it clear that it wasn't just an observation, but an accusation. It was a statement of invasion, an accusation of betrayal, and a sentence not yet pronounced, all condensed in 5 simple words that hung in the air between them like a heavy cloud. James remained motionless, while Frederick took another step toward him, the space between them diminishing threateningly. The son-in-law slowly reached toward the syringe on the table, his movements deliberate and calculated, as if he were dealing with a frightened animal that might flee at any moment. James watched every movement, his mind working frantically to find an exit, a solution, anything that could change the course of this terrible situation. He thought of Mrs. Margaret downstairs, alone and vulnerable, still recovering from the effects of the substance, and the urgency to return to her burned in his chest like fire. Frederick picked up the syringe with exaggerated care, holding it against the light as if admiring its transparent and deadly content. "Do you know what this is?" he asked with false casualness, spinning the object between his fingers. James didn't respond, but his silence was answer enough. Both knew exactly what that syringe represented. "It's fascinating how something so small can solve so many problems," Frederick continued, approaching closer. James instinctively took a step back, his back hitting the bookshelf. In a movement that surprised even himself, James stretched out his arm and struck Frederick's hand, making the syringe fly through the air in a perfect arc before falling to the floor with a tinkle of breaking glass. The transparent liquid spread across the polished floor, forming a small puddle that gleamed under the light. For a moment, both were paralyzed, looking at the glass shards and the spilled liquid, the reality of what had just happened crystallizing between them. Frederick's face went through a frightening transformation, from initial surprise to understanding, and then to such intense fury that James could practically feel the heat emanating from him. "You don't know what you just did," Frederick said, his voice trembling with contained rage. James knew exactly what he had done. He had destroyed the next dose destined for Mrs. Margaret, had interfered with Frederick's meticulous plan. "I know I saved her life," James responded, finding courage somewhere deep within himself. The response seemed to enrage Frederick even more, his eyes narrowing dangerously. Before James could react, Frederick grabbed him firmly and made it clear that James would pay dearly for having interfered. James tried to break free, but the substance in his system had robbed much of his strength, leaving him weak as a kitten in Frederick's hands. "We're going for a walk," Frederick said through gritted teeth, beginning to lead James toward the door. James tried to resist, but the substances had left him weak. James desperately thought of Mrs. Margaret. How long would she stay safe alone? How long until Frederick returned to her with another dose? "I'm not going anywhere with you," James shouted, hoping anyone could hear. But the house was empty except for the three of them, and Mrs. Margaret was too weak to help. "You'll go where I want. Nobody told you to interfere in a family matter. You could have kept your job, could have kept your family safe, but you decided to get in my way. Now you'll suffer the consequences," Frederick said with cruel satisfaction, opening the office door and pulling James into the corridor. James felt a wave of sadness thinking about how Mrs. Margaret would be destroyed if she knew that her own son-in-law was doing this. They reached a door at the end of the corridor that James knew but had rarely seen open, the entrance to the attic. Frederick opened it with a key he took from his pocket, revealing a narrow and steep staircase that climbed into darkness. "Up there," Frederick ordered, leading James toward the steps. James looked at the darkness above and felt a shiver of genuine fear. "What are you going to do?" he asked, though he feared the answer. Frederick didn't respond, just led him up. The climb was slow, each step a mountain for James's weak legs. Frederick was right behind, blocking any possibility of escape, his breathing heavy with effort and anger. The attic revealed itself when they reached the top, a dark and stuffy space, full of old furniture covered by sheets, stacked boxes, the smell of dust and abandonment heavy in the air. The only light came from small cracks in the tiles, thin rays of sun that cut through the darkness like blades. James barely had time to assess the environment. Frederick remained at the entrance, a dark silhouette against the weak light from the stairs. "You're going to stay here until I resolve this," he declared with frightening finality. James turned to protest, but the door was already closing. "Wait! You can't leave me here!" James shouted, throwing himself against the door. The sound of the key turning in the lock on the outside was his answer. James pounded on the door with his fists, the sound echoing in the confined space of the attic. "Get me out of here, Frederick, someone!" he shouted until his voice became hoarse but knew it was useless. The house was large and well built, with thick walls that muffled sound, and the attic was the most isolated place of all. His already limited strength was quickly exhausted, and he had to lean against the door not to fall. The darkness around him seemed oppressive, alive, full of shadows that danced as his eyes tried to adjust. He began to feel along the walls, looking for a light switch, but his fingers found only spiderwebs and dust accumulated over years. He stumbled over something, an old box perhaps, and almost fell, managing to balance at the last second. Panic was beginning to set in, not just from confinement, but from the thought of Mrs. Margaret alone with Frederick. "I need to get out of here," he told himself, forcing calm. "I need to think. I need to find a way out." There was always a way out, always a solution. He just needed to find it. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, James began to better distinguish the environment around him. The attic was larger than he had imagined, extending across the entire width of the house. Old furniture was piled like ghosts under dusty white sheets, cardboard boxes marked with dates from decades ago, a broken mirror leaning against the wall reflecting his fragmented image. He moved carefully through the space, the floorboards creaking under his feet, looking for anything that could help him. It was then that he noticed a crack between two floorboards wider than the others, through which filtered a thread of light from below. James immediately knelt, ignoring the pain in his knees, and put his eye to the crack. He could partially see the corridor below, and his heart raced when he heard voices. It was Frederick talking, and then, weak but unmistakable, Mrs. Margaret's voice responding. "She's awake," he thought with a mixture of relief and terror. At least she was alive. But for how long? The voices became clearer as James pressed his ear against the crack. Frederick was using that falsely gentle tone that James had learned to detest, sweet as poisoned honey. "Time for your medicine, Mrs." "Margaret," he was saying, and James could imagine the false smile on his face. "No, please." Mrs. Margaret's voice was weak but determined. "I know what you're doing, Frederick. I realized what happened. James tried to help me. Where is he? What did you do to him? Do you think you'll get away with all this? My driver is an innocent man. He has a good heart. What did you do to him? Tell me." There was a pause, and James held his breath. "James is confused," Frederick replied smoothly. "He had a dizzy spell and had to leave. Now it's just the two of us." James wanted to scream that it was a lie, that he was up there, but knew Frederick had chosen the attic precisely because the sound wouldn't reach Mrs. Margaret. "I don't want to take anything," Mrs. Margaret insisted, and James could hear the fear in her voice. "It's not a choice," Frederick's voice became harder. "You're going to take it one way or another." James heard sounds of movement, footsteps, and then Mrs. Margaret screamed, "No, let go of me, help!" Her screams tore James's heart to pieces. Desperation took hold of James as he heard the struggle happening below. The sounds were confusing. James heard strange sounds and Mrs. Margaret asking for help, unable to intervene. "It's for your own good, and stop resisting." James banged on the floor with his fists, shouted until his throat protested, but nothing reached them. Then, as calmly as it had begun, everything fell silent. A terrible silence, heavy, that made James's stomach turn. "Mrs. Margaret," he called uselessly through the crack. No answer. Only the sound of Frederick's footsteps moving away, and then a door closing. James stayed there kneeling for long moments, his forehead pressed against the dusty floor, tears of frustration and anger running down his face. He had failed her again, was trapped while she suffered, and the helplessness was almost unbearable. "Forgive me, ma'am," he whispered to the void. But then something changed within him. Sadness transformed into iron determination. "No, it's not over yet," he said aloud, getting up with renewed purpose. James began a systematic search of the attic, looking for any form of escape. His hands felt walls, tested windows, searched for tools, anything. The substance still affected his system, making everything seem slightly out of focus. But the urgency to save Mrs. Margaret gave him strength he didn't know he had. Behind an old wardrobe, he found what he was looking for. A small window, dirty and covered with spider webs, but a window nonetheless. It was tiny, barely big enough for a child to pass through, but James was willing to try. He pushed the wardrobe aside with considerable effort, the heavy furniture protesting against the floor with a loud creak. The window was stuck. Years of disuse had sealed the edges with dirt and rust. James looked for something to use as a tool and found an old metal hanger. "This will have to do," he muttered, beginning to force the frame. After minutes that seemed like hours, he achieved small progress. The window moved a few centimeters. Come on," he encouraged himself, sweat running down his face despite the attic's cold. The window continued to resist, each centimeter conquered with tremendous effort. James stopped for a moment to catch his breath, looking through the dirty glass at the world outside. He could see the back garden, the trees that Mrs. Margaret loved so much, the blue sky that seemed to mock his confinement. The fall would be considerable. The attic was on the third floor, but there was a roof ledge just below that could partially cushion it. It was risky, especially in his weakened state, but what choice did he have? Mrs. Margaret was down there, possibly unconscious or worse, and every second counted. He returned to work with the hanger, forcing, pulling, until finally something gave way. Not the window opening, but the glass cracking. That wasn't the plan, he thought, but adaptation was necessary. He looked around for something to protect his elbow and found an old sheet. He wrapped it around his arm several times, took a deep breath, and struck the glass with his elbow. "For Mrs. Margaret," he said before impact. The glass shattered with a sound that seemed deafening in the attic silence, pieces falling both inward and outward. James used the sheet to clean the remaining shards from the frame, working as quickly and quietly as possible. The opening was now free, but as he had feared, it was terribly small. He would have to contort himself to pass through, and even then he wasn't sure if he could make it. But the alternative was to stay there, helpless, while Frederick did who knows what to Mrs. Margaret. He put his head through first, feeling the fresh air outside like a blessing after the attic's stuffy air. His shoulders were more difficult, having to turn them at an angle to pass through the narrow frame. He was halfway through, his torso outside and his legs still inside, when he felt the frame catch on his waist. He was stuck. "No, not now," he murmured desperately, trying to wriggle. Panic began to rise. He was too vulnerable like this, half in, half out, completely defenseless. "Calm down, James," he told himself. "Think." He tried to use his hands to push himself, but didn't have adequate support. It was then that James heard the sound that made his blood freeze. Heavy footsteps climbing the attic stairs, the steps creaking under someone's weight who climbed unhurriedly, as if knowing exactly what they would find at the top. Each creak was like a countdown, marking the seconds until the inevitable confrontation. The panic that James had managed to control until that moment exploded into genuine terror, running through his body like electricity. He was completely vulnerable, stuck in the window like an animal in a trap, half his body hanging outside, half still inside the dark attic. He couldn't go forward. The frame squeezed his waist like a vice, nor go back. He didn't have enough support to push himself back. The footsteps continued, methodical, inexorable, and James could imagine Frederick climbing with that cold smile he had seen in the office. He thought of Mrs. Margaret down there alone and defenseless, and the thought gave him one last wave of desperation. He contorted himself with all the strength he still had, feeling the window frame dig into his skin through his clothes, but it was no use. "Please," he whispered to the universe, to God, to any force that might be listening. The footsteps were almost at the top now. James closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control the accelerated breathing that threatened to turn into hyperventilation. He could feel the warm sun on his back and shoulders, the part of his body that was outside, while his legs still hung in the stuffy and dusty air of the attic. It was a surreal sensation, being divided between two worlds. Freedom so close but impossible to reach, and the prison from which he couldn't escape. The footsteps had stopped in the middle of the stairs, and the sudden silence was even more terrifying than the sound. What was Frederick doing? Was he listening? Planning? James tried to stay completely still, but his body trembled involuntarily from the effort of maintaining that uncomfortable position. His hands, stretched outside the window, desperately searched for something, anything he could use to pull himself, but found only the smooth surface of the external wall. Mrs. Margaret, he thought, using her image as an anchor for his sanity. "I need to get out of here for her." The footsteps resumed, 2 more steps, then stopped again. The terror of being completely vulnerable made James's mind race in 1,000 directions. Thoughts about everything he still had to live, flooding his consciousness. His children, Sophie, Harry, and Christopher, would be waiting for him to come home that night, as they always waited. Sophie was only 15 and had asked for help with the essay about her dreams for the future. How could he not be there to see those dreams come true? Harry, 12 years old, had a soccer game on Saturday and had begged his father to watch for the first time in months. Christopher, the youngest at 8, still slept hugging the toy car James had given him for his birthday. "Dad, do you promise you'll never leave me?" Christopher had asked last week after a nightmare. James had promised, had sworn he would always be there. Would this be another broken promise? His wife Mary was at home now, probably preparing lunch without knowing her husband was stuck in a window at the mercy of a desperate man. They had planned for years to take a trip to the sea, saving every extra penny, dreaming of the day the children would see the ocean for the first time. "I can't die like this," he thought desperately. "I can't leave them." The footsteps climbed 2 more steps, the sound echoing like execution drums. There was so much James still hadn't done, so many unlived moments that now seemed impossible. He had never taken Christopher fishing as his own father had done with him. He had never taught Harry to drive, something the boy was already anxious to learn. He would never see Sophie graduate, get married, have her own children. He would never grow old beside Mary, never have that house with a yard they dreamed of so much, never retire to spend days caring for a garden as he always wanted. All those little things that form a life, all those common moments we only realize are precious when they're about to be taken from us. Frederick could end all of this in seconds. A man who had already tried to murder his own mother-in-law wouldn't hesitate with an inconvenient driver. James could imagine the excuses: an accident, a fall, a sudden illness. Who would question the word of a respectable son-in-law against a dead driver? Mary wouldn't even know the truth, he thought with horror. His children would grow up thinking their father had died in a stupid accident. They would never know he had died trying to save someone. Please, God, he prayed silently, give me one more chance. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. James heard the key turn in the lock and knew he had no more time. With a superhuman effort born of pure desperation, he contorted his body with all the strength he could muster, feeling the window frame scrape painfully against his waist. For a terrible moment, he thought he would be stuck forever. But then something gave way, maybe the old wood, maybe his own body, finding an impossible angle. And suddenly, he was falling. The roof appeared too fast, the sun-hot tiles hitting his back as he rolled uncontrollably down the inclined surface. His hands frantically searched for something to hold onto, his fingers scratching the tiles, until he finally managed to grab the edge of the gutter. The old metal groaned under his weight, but held. James hung for a moment, catching his breath before continuing down. He could hear Frederick shouting something up there, but didn't stop to listen. I need to get to the garden, he thought, calculating the distance. It was too high to jump, but there was a trellis with plants on the side wall. The descent down the trellis was agonizing, each movement sending waves of pain through his body, already weakened by the substance. The plant branches broke under his weight, but the wooden structure held, creaking threateningly, but serving its purpose. When his feet finally touched the garden's soft grass, James almost collapsed with relief and exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. Mrs. Margaret was still inside, still in mortal danger. He began running toward the front of the house, his legs shaky but working, when he heard the unmistakable sound of tires on the entrance gravel. Their car was arriving, and when he rounded the side of the mansion, he saw Dorothy's silver sedan parking. It was as if fate had given him one last chance. Dorothy was getting out of the car, looking for something in her purse, completely oblivious to the nightmare happening inside her childhood home. James ran to her, stumbling in his own urgency, waving his arms to get her attention. "Dorothy! Dorothy, wait!" he shouted with what little voice he still had. She looked up, evident surprise on her face, seeing his deplorable state. Dorothy instinctively took a step back upon seeing James approaching, sweaty, with torn and dirty clothes, clearly in a state of extreme agitation. She pressed her purse against her body, her eyes quickly scanning the environment as if looking for other people. "James! My God! What happened to you?" she asked, concern apparent in her educated voice. James stopped a few steps from her, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath to explain the inexplicable. How to tell a daughter that her husband was trying to murder her mother? But there was no gentle way to say this, no time for subtleties. He straightened up, looking directly into her eyes, and let the words come out in a desperate torrent. "Dorothy, your mother is in mortal danger. Frederick has been giving her substances, trying to incapacitate her to get her money. Today he almost killed her. I saved her, did CPR, but he locked me in the attic and went back to give her more. Please, you need to help me save her." The words hung in the air between them like an impossible accusation to ignore. Dorothy's face went through a series of expressions, shock, disbelief, fear, in a matter of seconds. She shook her head as if trying to physically deny the words she had heard. "That's absurd," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Frederick loves my mother. He would never do something like that. You must be confused. Maybe you got intoxicated with something." But James could see the doubt in her eyes, that little seed of suspicion that maybe was already there, waiting for confirmation. How many times had she noticed strange behaviors? How many times had she ignored signs for not wanting to believe? James knew he needed something more concrete than words. He took his phone from his pocket with still trembling hands and opened the photo gallery. "I have proof," he said firmly. "I photographed everything in his office. I installed a camera. You need to believe me. Your husband is not a good person. He's not who you think. I always suspected him. I had heard your mother sometimes, but I thought she would tell me if she were in danger, but I believe she didn't even realize the risk she was running. You need to help us. Please, just look." Dorothy hesitated, looking from the phone to the house as if calculating her options. "Please," James pleaded, "for your mother." She took the phone. James watched every change in Dorothy's face as she went through the photos. First the unlabeled bottles, methodically organized in that macabre box. Her face became paler, her fingers gripping the phone tighter. Then the prepared syringe, ready to be used, and he saw her lips part in a small gasp of horror. But it was when she reached the photos of the notebook that something really changed. Her hands began to visibly tremble as she read her own husband's annotations about her mother's progressive decline, documented like a cold experiment. Dose increased today, more confusion, signed without reading, was written in one entry. Perfect for the apartment transfer, in another. James saw tears form in her eyes, one running down her perfectly made-up face. "My God," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. She continued going through the photos, absorbing each terrible piece of evidence of the crime. "How long?" she finally managed to ask. "How long has this been happening?" James felt immense relief. She was believing. "According to the annotations, months," James replied gently, conscious of how devastating this must be for her. But today he tried something stronger. "Your mother almost died, Dorothy. I managed to bring her back, but Frederick won't stop. He's with her right now, probably trying to give another dose. He expected to see Dorothy run to the house, scream for help, do something to save her mother. Instead, she became very quiet, looking from the phone to the house, then to James. There was something different in her eyes now, something that made a chill run down James's spine. She returned the phone to him calmly, too calmly for someone who had just discovered her husband was poisoning her mother. Then she looked toward the house and took a deep breath. What happened next was so unexpected, so shocking that James was paralyzed with disbelief. "Frederick!" Dorothy shouted with all the strength of her lungs, her voice echoing through the garden. "The driver escaped." James felt the world spin around him. The understanding hit James like ice water. Dorothy knew. She always knew. Maybe not all the details, maybe not the exact method, but she knew and was an accomplice. The horror of this realization paralyzed him for precious seconds, while Dorothy continued shouting. "He's out here. He has everything recorded." The front door burst open and Frederick appeared, his face contorted with fury and something more, fear. His eyes found James and narrowed dangerously. Dorothy pointed at James as if he were a criminal caught in the act. "He showed photos of your office, said he recorded you with Mum." Frederick came down the entrance steps two at a time, coming toward James with murderous determination. It was the shock of Dorothy's betrayal that finally broke James out of his paralysis. He turned around and began running toward the property gate, toward the street, toward anywhere that wasn't there. "Get him!" he heard Dorothy shout behind him. His feet stumbled on the grass, his body still weak, but survival instinct propelled him. James ran like he had never run before, each step a fight against the weakness that still dominated his body. He could hear Frederick behind him, the heavy footsteps on the gravel getting closer. The property gate seemed impossibly distant, but it was his only chance. His lungs burned, his legs trembled, but he continued, driven by the image of Mrs. Margaret alone and defenseless in the house. As he passed through the gate and reached the street, something miraculous happened. His phone vibrated in his hand. Signal. Finally there was signal. Without stopping running, James dialed the emergency number, his sweaty fingers almost dropping the device. "Police!" he shouted as soon as they answered. "Fernandez Mansion, Palm Tree Street. We need you to come as fast as possible. It's an emergency. We're in danger." He continued running while talking, giving more details, the exact address, please to hurry. Behind him, he could hear Frederick shouting for Dorothy to do something. "They're coming after me," he said into the phone. "Please hurry." The calm voice of the operator tried to calm him, but James barely listened, focused only on continuing to run. 5 minutes passed like 5 hours, James hidden behind a thick tree on the corner, his body trembling not just from the effort of escape, but also from the residual effects of the substance in his system. He kept the line open with the emergency service, the phone pressed against his ear while the operator asked him to stay on the line, assuring that the units were on their way. From his position, he could clearly see the mansion entrance, watching every movement through the lit windows. Frederick and Dorothy had returned inside after giving up chasing him, and he could see them occasionally passing by the ground floor windows. They seemed to be in a heated discussion, Dorothy gesticulating frantically, while Frederick tried to appear calm and controlled. They must be coordinating a story, James thought, anger mixed with concern for Mrs. Margaret. With each second that passed without sirens, his heart tightened more. "Please hurry," he murmured to the operator. "The elderly lady is alone in there with them." His mind couldn't stop imagining what they might be doing, destroying evidence, forcing more substance into Mrs. Margaret, creating a scenario that would exonerate them. James slightly changed position when his legs began to tingle, but stayed hidden behind the tree. He could feel the phone heating against his ear from the long call, but didn't dare hang up. It was his only connection to help, his only guarantee that someone would come. The street was deserted at that time of day. Neighbors probably working, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the neighborhood's most imposing mansion. He watched Dorothy appear at the living room window, talking on the phone now, probably trying to contact some lawyer or create an alibi. Frederick had disappeared from sight, and that worried him even more. Where is he? He thought anxiously. What is he doing to Mrs. Margaret? The operator continued asking questions, confirming details, and James answered automatically, while his eyes remained fixed on the house. Every minute seemed like an eternity. Every second could be too late for Mrs. Margaret. He tried not to think the worst, but the images came involuntarily. Frederick forcing more substance on her, Dorothy helping, the two eliminating the only witness besides him. "Resist, Mrs. Margaret," he thought desperately. "Help is coming." Sweat ran down James's back despite the tree's shade, a mixture of anxiety and the persistent effects of the substance. His mouth was still dry, his tongue still slightly numb, constant reminders of the danger he had faced. He checked the time on his phone. 3 minutes had passed since the call, but it seemed like a lifetime. The operator said the units were less than 5 minutes away, but every second counted. He saw Frederick reappear at the second-floor window, Mrs. Margaret's room. His heart raced in panic. "He's with her," he said urgently to the operator. "The suspect is in the victim's room now." The operator asked for calm, informed that she was relaying the information to the units, but James could barely control the impulse to run back to the house. Only the certainty that it would be useless, Frederick and Dorothy together would easily overpower him in his weakened state, kept him hidden. He watched Frederick move around the room, apparently looking for something, maybe the cameras James had installed. "You won't find them all," he thought with grim satisfaction, remembering the micro camera in the lamp. A car passed slowly down the street, and James shrank further against the tree, fearing being seen. But it was just a neighbor returning home, who didn't even look toward the Fernandez mansion. James returned his attention to the house, noticing that Dorothy had also gone upstairs. Both were now in Mrs. Margaret's room. This couldn't be good. His imagination created increasingly worse scenarios. They could be moving Mrs. Margaret, trying to make it look like she had fallen, creating a scene that would explain her condition without implicating them. 2 minutes, the operator said in his ear. "The units are 2 minutes away." James gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles white with tension. Through the window he saw sudden movement, shadows stirring, and his heart almost stopped. "They're doing something to her," he shouted into the phone. "Please tell them to hurry." The operator maintained professional calm, assuring she was transmitting everything in real time, but James barely heard her, his eyes fixed on the second-floor window, where Mrs. Margaret's fate was being decided. It was then that James saw something that filled him with hope and terror in equal measure. Dorothy appeared at the window, holding what looked like the bottles from Frederick's office. She was taking them somewhere, probably to destroy or hide them. "They're getting rid of evidence," he informed the operator, describing what he saw, but then he remembered. He had photos of everything on his phone. Even if they destroyed the physical bottles, the digital evidence would remain. Frederick appeared beside Dorothy at the window, and James could see from their body language that they were arguing. Dorothy pointed outside, probably saying James could return with police at any moment. Frederick seemed to be arguing, maybe wanting to finish something before they fled. "Don't run away," James thought desperately. "How you need to pay for what you did." The operator informed that the units had turned the corner of the main street. "Less than a minute," she said, and James felt a wave of relief so strong it almost knocked him down. "Almost there, Mrs. Margaret," he murmured. "Hold on just a little longer." Then he heard it. the sweetest sound in the world, sirens. First distant, then approaching rapidly, multiple units converging on the mansion. James came out of his hiding place and waved frantically when the first patrol car appeared. "Here, over here," he shouted. The officer who got out was young but seemed competent, listening quickly while James explained about Mrs. Margaret in danger. More units arrived, an ambulance too, and in a matter of minutes there was a small police force surrounding the property. James guided them, showing where Mrs. Margaret's room was, pleading for them to hurry. He could see Frederick and Dorothy through the living room window, she gesticulating frantically while he tried to appear calm. "She's upstairs," James told the paramedics. "Second room on the right. Please, save her." They ran inside. The following minutes were a blur of activity. James saw the paramedics run up the stairs, police surrounding Frederick and Dorothy, who tried to explain something about a misunderstanding. Then, the moment he was waiting for, the paramedics came down carrying Mrs. Margaret on a stretcher. She was unconscious, but there was medical equipment connected, IV being administered, signs they were treating her. James tried to approach, but a police officer gently held him back. "Let them work," the officer said. From where he stood, James could see Frederick being handcuffed, protesting loudly about his rights, about it being a misunderstanding. Dorothy was also being detained, false tears streaming down her face while she claimed innocence. "We have a notebook with evidence in the office," James told the officer beside him. "Second floor, desk drawer. And there are hidden cameras recording everything." The officer nodded and transmitted the information over the radio. "You did the right thing," he told James. The ambulance was ready to leave with Mrs. Margaret when one of the paramedics waved for James to approach. She was a middle-aged woman with kind but experienced eyes, the kind that seemed to have seen all the tragedies and miracles life can offer. James walked to her with uncertain steps, each movement a reminder that his own body was still fighting against the effects of the substance. "Are you James?" she asked, her voice professional but warm. When he nodded, unable to trust his voice at that moment, she smiled slightly, a smile that carried compassion and respect. "The lady is stable. We detected the substance in her system and are treating it. You saved her life with that CPR. A few more minutes and it would have been too late." The words hit James like a wave, and he felt his legs weaken with relief, so intense he needed to lean against the side of the ambulance. All the terror, all the adrenaline, all the fear that had sustained him until that moment evaporated instantly, leaving only deep exhaustion and a relief that brought tears to his eyes. "She's going to live," he repeated mentally, as if he needed to confirm it to himself. "Mrs. Margaret is going to live." It was then that the paramedic examined him more attentively, her trained eyes quickly scanning the signs James presented. She noticed what he had tried to hide. Eyes still slightly unfocused that couldn't maintain focus for long, the persistent tremor in his hands that he tried to control by clenching them into fists, the sickly pallor under the sweat covering his face. Years of experience had taught her to recognize signs of intoxication, and something in James's state triggered her professional alarms. "Wait," she said, holding his arm gently but firmly, preventing him from moving away. Her fingers automatically found his pulse, feeling the irregular rhythm. "Were you also exposed?" The question came loaded with genuine concern. James nodded weakly, suddenly conscious of how bad he felt now that the adrenaline was subsiding. "When I gave her mouth-to-mouth," he explained, the words coming out with difficulty, his tongue still slightly numb, making articulation difficult. There was substance in her mouth. He saw the paramedic's eyes widen in understanding and concern, and she immediately turned to call a colleague. "Marco, we need to examine him too," she said, with professional firmness that brooked no discussion. "We'll administer preventive treatment right now." The relief James felt at finally being cared for was almost as strong as what he felt knowing Mrs. Margaret was stable. Throughout the morning, he had ignored his own discomfort, focused only on saving his employer and friend. Now, with professional paramedics taking control, he allowed himself to finally acknowledge how bad he was. His legs trembled not just from exhaustion, but from the residual effects of the substance. His vision occasionally blurred at the edges, and there was a persistent sensation of disconnection, as if he were observing everything through glass. The paramedic called Marco approached quickly with a medical kit, his movements efficient and precise. "How long ago was the exposure?" he asked while checking James's vital signs. "Maybe an hour, maybe more," James replied, trying to calculate. Time had lost meaning during the crisis. Everything seemed to have happened in minutes and at the same time in days. Marco nodded understandingly while preparing the IV. "The good news is that secondary exposure is usually less severe," he explained, trying to calm James. "But we still need to treat and monitor." James just nodded, grateful to be in good hands. While the paramedic inserted the needle for the IV, James kept his eyes fixed on Mrs. Margaret on the stretcher, inside the ambulance. Even unconscious and connected to various equipment, she seemed more at peace than he had seen in recent weeks. Now that he thought about it, the signs had been there for some time. The growing confusion, inexplicable weakness, moments of disorientation that everyone attributed to age. "I should have noticed before," he thought with a pang of guilt. How many times had Frederick offered to help with Mrs. Margaret's medicines? How many times had Dorothy insisted her mother needed special care? The signs were all there, but he had been too blind, too trusting to see. The paramedic must have noticed his expression because he said gently, "You did everything you could. She's alive because of you." James wanted to believe that, but the guilt persisted. If he had been more attentive, if he had questioned more, maybe he could have prevented it from reaching this point. "At least I arrived in time today," he consoled himself. "At least she's going to survive." While the paramedics cared for James, administering IV and checking his vital signs right there beside the ambulance, he kept his eyes on Mrs. Margaret on the stretcher. Even unconscious, she seemed more at peace now, knowing she was in good hands. "The amount you ingested was small," explained the paramedic attending him, a young man with skilled hands. "But it can still have residual effects for a few days. We'll need to monitor you too." James nodded, but his attention was divided between his own treatment and watching Frederick and Dorothy being placed in separate patrol cars. The paramedic followed his gaze and said quietly, "You were very brave. Not everyone would risk their own life like that." James thought of Mrs. Margaret, of all the years of kindness, of how she was more than an employer. "She would have done the same for me," he replied simply. The paramedic smiled and continued checking his signs. "Your heartbeat is still a bit irregular. We'll need to take you to the hospital too for observation." James didn't protest. He wanted to be near Mrs. Margaret anyway. An older police officer, probably the one in charge of the operation, approached while James was still receiving IV. He had a tired but kind face, one of those who had seen too much but still cared. "Mr. James," he said, "I'm the detective in charge. We'll need your full statement, but it can be after the doctors clear you." He looked at the paramedic, who nodded, confirming James was stable enough to talk. "I want you to know," the detective continued, "that the lady is alive thanks to you. What you did today was heroic." James didn't feel like a hero. He was exhausted, sore, emotionally destroyed by Dorothy's betrayal, and now discovering he still had substance in his system. But Mrs. Margaret was alive, and that was all that mattered. "I just did what I had to do," he replied, his voice still hoarse. The detective nodded understandingly. "We found the notebook and are analyzing the cameras. With your testimony and the evidence, they won't escape this." He looked at James with genuine respect. While James was being helped into a second ambulance to also be taken to the hospital, he took one last look at the Fernandez mansion. The paramedic held his arm, guiding him gently, but James stopped for a moment, needing that final look. The house that had been a second home for 8 years now seemed different under the late afternoon light. The white walls he had always found elegant now seemed cold. The windows he knew so well now held terrible secrets he had never suspected. How many mornings had he parked the car in exactly that spot, waiting for Mrs. Margaret to come down for another ordinary day? How many afternoons had he spent in the garden talking with her about life, about the flowers she loved to cultivate so much? Now that same garden had been the scene of his desperate escape. Those same walls had witnessed an attempted murder. But also, he thought with a pang of pride mixed with relief, it was the place where he had saved a life, where he had proven that loyalty and love were stronger than greed and betrayal. Not everything is lost, he thought, allowing the paramedic to help him into the ambulance. Evil didn't win today. The paramedic adjusted the IV in his arm with precise movements and checked his vital signs once more, writing something on a clipboard. James watched everything with a surreal sense of disconnection. Hours ago, he was fighting for Mrs. Margaret's life. Now he was the one being cared for. "We're going to the same hospital as the lady," the paramedic informed, noticing the poorly disguised anxiety on James's face. "You'll be able to see her once you're both stable." The relief he felt hearing this was palpable. He wouldn't be separated from her, could ensure she would be okay, could be there when she woke up. He imagined the moment she would open her eyes, finally free from the nightmare Frederick and Dorothy had created. Would she remember everything? Would she be devastated to learn of her own daughter's betrayal? James promised himself he would be there to support her, as she had always been there for him. "You won't go through this alone," he thought determinedly. "You'll never be alone again with people who want to harm you." James took his phone with his free hand, noticing it still trembled slightly. The device was stained with his sweaty fingerprints, the screen cracked in one corner from when he almost dropped it during the escape. But it worked, and that's what mattered. He dialed home, each ring seeming like an eternity until Mary answered. "Honey?" he said when she answered, his voice still weak but full of a relief that came from the depths of his soul. He could imagine Mary in the kitchen, probably preparing lunch, completely unaware of the drama her husband had lived through. "I'm going to be late getting home today. I had to go to the hospital, but everything's okay now." "I'm fine, just need observation." The words came out carefully chosen. He didn't want to scare her more than necessary, but also couldn't lie. He could hear the immediate concern in her voice, questions piling up, the maternal fear he knew so well. "James, what happened? Are you hurt? Was it an accident?" He calmed her with the firmest voice he could manage. "I'll explain everything later. Just know I did the right thing today." There was so much pride in those words, so much meaning Mary couldn't yet comprehend. He thought about how he would explain everything to his family later. How to tell the children that Daddy had been a hero today, but had almost died in the process. How to explain that Grandma Margaret, as the children affectionately called her, had been a victim of her own daughter. These were difficult conversations he would have, hard truths he would have to share. But for now, just knowing everyone was safe was enough. "Kiss the children for me," he told Mary before hanging up. "Tell them Daddy loves them very much and will be home as soon as he can." Mary agreed, still worried but trusting him as she always did. After hanging up, James held the phone against his chest for a moment. The device that had been so crucial, the photos he took, the call to police, everything had depended on that small device. Technology saving lives, he thought with irony. Frederick had been meticulous in his plan, but hadn't counted on the determination of a driver armed with a cell phone and courage. As the ambulance pulled away from the mansion, sirens on but without the frantic urgency from before, James closed his eyes and finally allowed himself to process everything that had happened. The images came in flashes, Mrs. Margaret's pale face when he found her, the bitter taste of the substance, the desperate escape through the attic, the betrayal on Dorothy's face. Each memory brought a wave of emotions, fear, anger, sadness, relief, all mixed in an emotional cocktail that left him exhausted. But above all, there was gratitude. Gratitude for arriving in time, for being strong enough, for making a difference. He thought of all the moments when he could have failed, if he hadn't done CPR, if he hadn't escaped the attic, if he hadn't gotten signal on his phone. So many what-ifs that could have resulted in tragedy. But they didn't. "We made it, ma'am," he murmured, knowing Mrs. Margaret couldn't hear him in the other ambulance but needing to say it anyway. "We both made it. Justice had prevailed, good had defeated evil, and 2 lives had been saved." It was more than many achieve in an entire lifetime, and he had done it in a single morning. 3 days had passed since the nightmare at the Fernandez mansion, and James maintained constant vigil beside the hospital bed where Mrs. Margaret rested. The private room was simple but comfortable, with walls in a soft peach tone and a large window that let in the morning light. James had brought a vase with flowers from her garden, the same yellow roses she cultivated with such care, and placed it on the nightstand where she could see them when she woke up. He watched every movement of hers, every change in breathing, waiting for the moment she would open her eyes. The doctors had said she was recovering well, that the substance had been almost completely eliminated from her system, but that it would take time for her to fully awaken. James wasn't in a hurry. He had requested leave from work, explained everything to his new temporary employer, and was determined to be there when she needed him. "Who saved my life so many times without knowing?" he thought, gently adjusting the blanket over her. "Now it's my turn to take care of you." The heart monitor maintained its constant rhythm, a sound that had become strangely comforting. It was then that James noticed a subtle change. Mrs. Margaret's fingers moved slightly. Then her breathing became deeper. He leaned forward, gently holding her hand, and watched as her eyelids trembled before finally opening. For a moment, her eyes were unfocused, wandering around the room without recognizing anything. But then they found James, and something changed. Recognition emerged like sunrise, slow but undeniable. "James?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse but clear, completely lucid. There was no confusion in her eyes, no fog from the substance that had clouded her mind for so long. Tears of relief streamed down James's face before he could contain them. "I'm here, Ma'am," he said, squeezing her hand with infinite affection. "You're safe now, you're in the hospital, but everything's okay." Mrs. Margaret looked around, absorbing the environment, and then her eyes filled with tears too. "I remember everything," she said, and the pain in that simple statement broke James's heart. "Frederick, he was giving me something," Mrs. Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I tried to resist, but it became increasingly difficult to think, harder to remember. And Dorothy..." Her voice broke mentioning her daughter's name, and tears began to flow freely down her face. James took a tissue and gently dried her tears, his own heart tight with empathy. "She knew, didn't she?" Mrs. Margaret asked, though the answer was clear in her eyes. James nodded gravely, not wanting to lie to her but hating having to confirm the terrible truth. "My own daughter," she sobbed, turning her face to the pillow. "How could she? I gave everything to her, loved her unconditionally." James held her hand more firmly, searching for the right words to comfort someone whose own daughter had tried to destroy her. "Greed changes people, Ma'am," he said softly. "But you have a new family now. Me, Mary, the children, we'll always be with you." Mrs. Margaret looked at him through her tears, and something like hope shone in her eyes. "The children," Mrs. Margaret said with a small smile, the first since she woke up. "How are Sophie, Harry, and Christopher? Do they know what happened?" James shook his head. "I told them you were sick but getting better. Christopher made a drawing for you." He took a folded paper from his bag, a colorful drawing of a house with a garden full of flowers, and several stick figures representing the whole family, including Mrs. Margaret. "He said it's our new house where we're all going to live together," James explained, and saw Mrs. Margaret's eyes fill with tears again, but this time they were tears of emotion, not sadness. "They're wonderful children," she said, tracing the figures with her finger. "You and Mary did an incredible job with them." They stayed in silence for a moment, both lost in thoughts about family, the one that betrays and the one we choose. "You know," Mrs. Margaret finally said, "I always considered you like the son I never had." James felt his own throat tighten with emotion. A knock on the door interrupted the intimate moment. A man in a dark suit entered, carrying a leather briefcase under his arm. It was the family lawyer, Dr. Smith, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a serious but gentle expression. James knew him by sight from the few times he had taken Mrs. Margaret to his office. "Mrs. Margaret, how good to see you awake," he said with genuine relief. "James," he nodded in acknowledgement, "I have important news about the case." "Mrs." Margaret tried to sit up straighter, and James quickly adjusted the pillows behind her. "You can speak," she said with a strength that surprised everyone. The lawyer opened his briefcase and took out some documents. "Frederick and Dorothy confessed," he said without beating around the bush. Faced with the evidence, the photos James took, the camera recordings, the notebook with the annotations, they had no choice. "Mrs." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, processing the information. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why did they do this?" The lawyer sighed before continuing. "Dorothy was in debt to loan sharks," the lawyer explained, his voice professional but with a touch of compassion, like someone delivering a difficult but necessary diagnosis. He opened a folder with documents and bank statements, meticulously organized evidence of the financial disaster. Apparently, she developed a serious gambling problem about 2 years ago. It started with small online bets, then progressed to clandestine casinos, high-stakes card games. We found records of frequent trips to casinos in neighboring cities, always alone, always losing larger amounts each time. The lawyer passed some sheets for Mrs. Margaret to see, but James noticed her hands trembled too much to hold the papers. The loan sharks she owed weren't ordinary people. They were part of a criminal organization known for violent collection methods. She owed almost $3 million, with compound interest rising daily. There were documented threats, messages saying if she didn't pay, the whole family would suffer consequences. James felt Mrs. Margaret tense beside him, her hand squeezing his like it was an anchor. "My daughter. Involved with criminals," she murmured, horror evident in her voice. Frederick, in turn, had his own catastrophic financial problems, the lawyer continued, turning to another section of documents. He had invested all the fortune he inherited from his father, plus substantial loans, in cryptocurrencies during the boom. When the market crashed, he lost 90% of the value. Desperate to recover, he began making increasingly risky bets, volatile stocks, dubious startups, schemes bordering on financial pyramids. We found evidence he had forged Dorothy's signature on loans, used her name without permission. He was on the brink of total bankruptcy, but maintained appearances. The luxury car was rented, the expensive watch was fake, the designer clothes were bought and returned after wearing. The lawyer paused, allowing the information to be absorbed. Together, they owed more than $5 million, with increasingly aggressive creditors. That's when they started looking at your estate, Mrs. Margaret. James felt nauseous thinking about the couple's coldness, planning to destroy their own mother for money. How could they? Mrs. Margaret asked, more to herself than to anyone. They planned everything meticulously for months, the lawyer continued, his voice becoming graver. But we found emails exchanged between them, internet searches for how to simulate dementia, medications that cause mental confusion, how to obtain power of attorney from incapacitated elderly. Anna Frederick bought the substances from a corrupt veterinarian. They were sedatives for horses, diluted in doses that wouldn't kill but would cause progressive confusion, memory loss, disorientation. The plan was to gradually incapacitate her over 6 months to a year, make it seem like natural dementia to doctors and acquaintances. They started with small doses in afternoon tea, gradually increasing. They documented their concerns about her mental health in emails to create a record, in case they needed to prove in court. The lawyer showed screenshots of the emails, each more incriminating than the last. They even researched nursing homes where they could permanently institutionalize her after gaining total control of the assets. The goal was to assume control of everything. The house worth $5 million, the financial investments of about $3 million, the family jewels valued at $1 million, the art collection. Mrs. Margaret closed her eyes, tears silently streaming down her cheeks. The most disturbing part, the lawyer hesitated before continuing, clearly reluctant to cause more pain, is that they discussed in messages what to do if you resisted too much or recovered. Frederick suggested increasing the dose until it looked like natural death from old age. Dorothy agreed, saying it would be merciful given her mother's deteriorated mental state. James felt rage boil in his veins hearing this. It wasn't just theft, it was premeditated murder disguised as compassion. Mrs. Margaret sobbed openly now, the total extent of the betrayal hitting her like successive waves of pain. "How long specifically?" she managed to ask through tears. The lawyer consulted his papers. The first evidence dates back 8 months. Online searches, substance purchases. The actual administration began 6 months ago, initially once a week, then increasing to daily doses in the last 2 months. That's why you deteriorated so rapidly at the end. James hugged Mrs. Margaret as she cried, his own anger mixed with relief that they had stopped in time. But thanks to James, the lawyer looked at him with deep and genuine respect. Their entire meticulous plan collapsed in a single day. The photographs you took of Frederick's notebook, where he recorded doses and effects, are irrefutable evidence. The camera recordings clearly show the forced administration of the substance. Your testimony, corroborated by medical exams that confirmed the presence of the substance in both you and Mrs. Margaret, sealed the case. Dorothy broke first during interrogation, trying to put all the blame on Frederick. He in turn tried to say it was her idea. In the end, both confessed completely when confronted with the evidence. The lawyer closed the briefcase with a heavy sigh. It's one of the cruelest cases of elder abuse I've seen in 30 years of practice, but it's also one of the cases where justice was most clearly served, thanks to your courage, Mr. James. Mrs. Margaret squeezed James's hand with all the strength she had, looking at him with infinite gratitude, mixed with the pain of family betrayal. What happens now? Mrs. Margaret asked, her voice firmer, the businesswoman she had been all her life beginning to emerge. The lawyer flipped through a few more papers. Both will be tried for attempted murder, extortion, forgery, among other charges. Frederick will probably get 15 to 20 years. Dorothy, as an accomplice, might get 8 to 12 years. Mrs. Margaret nodded slowly, her face a mask of contained emotions. And what about my grandchildren? She asked, and James admired her ability to think of Dorothy's children even after everything. The children are with Frederick's sister for now, the lawyer informed, but we need to discuss permanent arrangements. Mrs. Margaret was thoughtful for a moment before speaking. I want to create a fund for them, she said decisively. They're not to blame for their parents' crimes, but Dorothy, her voice hardened, she won't receive a penny. I want to completely disinherit her. The lawyer nodded, making notes. There's one more thing, Mrs. Margaret said, adjusting herself better in the hospital bed and looking directly at James with a determination he hadn't seen in months. She took both his hands in hers, her fingers still fragile but her grip surprisingly firm. James, I need to do something important, something I've been thinking about since I woke up and understood everything that happened. She paused, gathering courage for the next words. I want to name you as my legal attorney and guardian. If something happens to me, if I get sick, if I need care, I want it to be you making all decisions for me. Medical, financial, personal, everything. James was genuinely shocked, his face paling as he processed the weight of what she was proposing. He began to shake his head, opening his mouth to protest, but Mrs. Margaret raised her hand to silence him, her eyes shining with tears but also with absolute certainty. Please, listen to me before you refuse, she asked softly but firmly. It's the least I can do, Mrs. Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength with the conviction of her words. You risked your life for me, James. You almost died trying to save me. You were poisoned, trapped in an attic, chased, threatened. You could have simply left when you saw the danger, could have protected yourself, thought of your own family first. But you didn't. Tears now flowed freely down her face, but she made no move to wipe them. You're more family to me than my own daughter proved to be. More than that, you're the son I would choose if I could. In all these years working for me, you never asked for anything beyond your fair salary. You were never greedy, never took advantage, always honest and loyal. She squeezed his hands tighter. When my own daughter was poisoning me, you were saving me. When my son-in-law was planning my death, you risked your life to protect me. How can I not entrust my future to you? James was visibly emotional, struggling to find words. Ma'am, this is an enormous responsibility. Are you sure? I'm not family, technically. People might question, might think I have interests. Mrs. Margaret interrupted him with a gentle gesture. Let people talk, she said firmly. I know who you are. I know your character. I've seen you refuse tips I tried to give, seen you return extra change, seen you work overtime without charging because you were worried about me. She smiled through tears. Remember when my husband died? You took your savings to help with funeral flowers because you knew I had assets temporarily blocked. You never let me pay you back, always said it was a gift. James blushed, uncomfortable with the praise. Besides, Mrs. Margaret continued, who else would I choose? I don't trust anyone else the way I trust you. You proved your worth not with words but with actions, with sacrifice. The lawyer, who had observed the exchange in respectful silence, cleared his throat gently. Mr. James, I understand it's a significant decision, but I must say in my professional experience, I've never seen a bond of trust more clearly demonstrated. Mrs. Margaret is completely lucid and capable of making this decision. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at James. "Do you accept this responsibility?" he asked formally, preparing to document the answer. James looked at Mrs. Margaret, studying her anxious face, seeing not just the elderly woman he had saved, but the friend she had become, the grandmother she had been to his children, the constant and loving presence in their lives. He saw the absolute trust in her eyes, the genuine love, the need to know she would be safe, that someone trustworthy would care for her. He thought of Mary, knowing she would completely support this decision. He thought of his children, who adored Mrs. Margaret as true family. "It would be an honor," James finally said, his voice choked but clear. "I accept the responsibility, and I promise I will always make decisions thinking of your best interests, Ma'am. Always." The relief on Mrs. Margaret's face was palpable, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She began to cry openly, pulling James into a tight hug. "My son," she whispered in his ear, "my chosen son." James couldn't contain his own tears, hugging her back with infinite care. The lawyer smiled for the first time since entering, a genuine and warm smile. "I'll prepare all the documentation immediately," he said, clearly moved by the scene. "Mrs. Margaret, you have an exceptional guardian. And Mr. James, you've just accepted not only a legal responsibility, but a testament of love and trust I rarely see." He began making notes. "I'll ensure everything is done perfectly, ironclad, unquestionable. No one will be able to contest this decision." After discussing a few more technical details, specific powers, covered situations, legal safeguards, the lawyer said goodbye, promising to return the next day with documents for signing. When they were alone again, Mrs. Margaret and James remained in silence for a few moments, both processing the magnitude of what had just happened. "Thank you," Mrs. Margaret said softly, breaking the silence. "Thank you for accepting, for not making me feel like a burden, for understanding this isn't about money or power, but about trust and love." James smiled, still too emotional to speak properly. He held her hand gently. "Ma'am," he finally managed to say, "the honor is all mine. You gave me a family, a purpose beyond work, a second mother for my children. This," he gestured to the papers the lawyer had left, "is just formalizing what already exists. We're family, and family takes care of each other." Mrs. Margaret smiled through new tears, this time of pure joy and relief. The comfortable silence was broken by animated voices in the corridor. James immediately recognized his family had arrived. The door opened and Mary entered first, carrying a bouquet of colorful flowers, followed by Sophie, Harry, and Christopher. Christopher's face lit up seeing Mrs. Margaret awake. "Grandma Margaret!" he exclaimed, running to the bed before James could stop him. But Mrs. Margaret opened her arms, receiving the boy's careful hug with tears of joy. "Hello, my dear," she said, stroking his hair. "We brought flowers for you," Sophie said shyly, approaching. "Mum said you like flowers." Harry stayed back a bit, always the most reserved, but his eyes showed genuine concern. Mary approached and gently touched Mrs. Margaret's shoulder. "How are you feeling?" she asked with the maternal warmth that characterized everything she did. "Much better now," Mrs. Margaret replied, looking at all of them. "Surrounded by my true family." Mary and James exchanged an emotional look. Christopher was still clinging to Mrs. Margaret, his little face pressed against her arm. "Grandma Margaret," he said in his small voice, "are you going to get better? Dad said you were very sick." Mrs. Margaret looked at James, then back at Christopher, and smiled with infinite tenderness. "I'm going to be fine, dear," she said. "You know why? Because your dad saved me. He's a real hero." Christopher looked at his father with renewed admiration, and James felt his cheeks warm. "My dad is a hero," Christopher exclaimed, and Harry and Sophie agreed enthusiastically. "We always knew that," Sophie said with wisdom beyond her 15 years. Mary put her arm around James's waist, leaning on him with love. "We brought snacks," Harry announced, finally approaching with a bag. "Mom made the cookies you like." "Mrs. Margaret smiled, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness. "You're angels," she said. The room filled with animated conversation and laughter, while the children told Mrs. Margaret about their school adventures, showing drawings and sharing stories. James watched with his heart full. This was the real family, not the one of blood that betrays, but the one of choice that remains. Mary arranged the flowers in the vase, Sophie helped adjust Mrs. Margaret's pillows, Harry offered water, and Christopher didn't let go of her hand. It was a scene of pure and simple love, the kind money can't buy nor greed can corrupt. Mrs. Margaret found his eyes over the children's heads, and he saw deep gratitude mixed with something like peace. She had lost a daughter to greed, but gained an entire family through love. "James," she called softly, gesturing for him to approach. When he came close, she took his hand. "I need to ask your forgiveness," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The children continued talking, giving them a moment of privacy. "Forgiveness?" James was genuinely confused. "Ma'am, you did nothing wrong." Mrs. Margaret shook her head, tears forming again. "For everything you went through because of me," she said. "You almost died trying to save me. You were poisoned, trapped, chased, all because of me." James gently squeezed her hand, choosing his words carefully. "Ma'am," he began, looking into her eyes, "family protects family, always. You treated me like family from day one. You took care of me when my mother died, helped when my children needed it with a grandmother they never had. What I did was the minimum." Mrs. Margaret cried openly now, and Mary approached, putting her arm around her. "We love you," Mary said simply. "All of us." The children, noticing the emotion, also approached, creating a careful collective hug around Mrs. Margaret. "My family," she whispered. "My true family." The moment was interrupted by a nurse entering to check Mrs. Margaret's vital signs. "What a lively party," she commented with a warm smile. "It's good to see you so well accompanied." While she checked blood pressure and temperature, Christopher approached her. "Is Grandma Margaret going to be able to go home soon?" he asked hopefully. The nurse smiled at him. "If she continues improving like this, maybe in a few days." Christopher jumped with joy. "Is she going to live with us?" he asked, looking at his parents. James and Mary exchanged a look. It was something they had discussed, but still weren't sure how to approach. Mrs. Margaret saved them from the dilemma. "I'm going to buy a house near yours," she said. "That way we can see each other every day, but everyone will have their space." The children seemed satisfied with this. "But Sunday is family lunch day," Christopher declared, "always." Mrs. Margaret laughed, the most beautiful sound James had heard in months. As the afternoon progressed and the children began to get restless, Mary suggested it was time to go. "We'll be back tomorrow," she promised Mrs. Margaret. "I'll bring homemade soup." The children said goodbye with hugs and kisses, each promising to bring something special the next day. Sophie a book to read, Harry a card game, Christopher more drawings. After they left, Mrs. Margaret and James were alone again. The afternoon sun came through the window, bathing the room in golden light. "You know," Mrs. Margaret said thoughtfully, "I spent my whole life accumulating wealth, building an empire, thinking I was leaving a legacy for Dorothy." She paused, looking at the flowers James's family had brought. "But the real treasure was right in front of my eyes all along. People who love me for who I am, not for what I have." James nodded understandingly. "True wealth isn't in the bank," he said. "It's here," he pointed to his heart. The rest of the afternoon passed peacefully, with James reading the newspaper to Mrs. Margaret, talking about the future, making plans. She wanted to sell the mansion, too many bad memories now, and buy something smaller, more welcoming. She wanted to create a foundation to protect elderly people from family abuse, using her own experience to help others. James would be her right hand in this too. "We're going to turn something terrible into something good," she said with determination. As the day came to an end and Mrs. Margaret began to doze, James adjusted her blanket one last time. "Rest, ma'am," he said softly. "I'll be here when you wake up." She opened her sleepy eyes and smiled. "I know," she said simply. "Family protects family." As she fell asleep, James settled in the armchair beside the bed, keeping vigil as he had for 3 days. But now it was no longer a vigil of worry, it was a vigil of gratitude. They had survived the worst, and now they had a whole life of better days ahead. Sunday morning sun bathed Mrs. Margaret's new house garden with golden light that made the flowers seem even more vibrant. It was a modest house compared to the mansion, but overflowed with warmth and life in a way the previous property never had. Christopher was kneeling beside Mrs. Margaret in the rosebed, his small hands carefully holding a seedling while she taught him how to plant it. "Look, dear, you have to make the hole deep enough for the roots to breathe, but not so deep that the little plant gets lost," she explained patiently, guiding his little hands. The boy listened with reverent attention, completely absorbed in the lesson. On the other side of the garden, Sophie was sitting in a rocking chair with a book in her hands, reading aloud to Mrs. Margaret while they worked. It was a novel they had started together weeks ago, a tradition they had developed naturally. James watched the scene from the garden entrance, his heart warmed by the domestic tranquility. "I never imagined we'd get here," he thought, remembering the terror of that day 6 months ago. The transformation was miraculous. James walked along the stone path leading to the garden, carrying a box with fresh ingredients from the market. "Mrs." Margaret looked up at hearing his footsteps, and her face lit up with that smile she had completely recovered in recent months. She was healthy, lucid, taking only the correct medications under proper medical supervision, a reborn woman. "James!" "You arrived just in time," she said cheerfully. "Christopher and I are planting the roses you suggested." Christopher jumped up and ran to his father, his earth-dirty hands leaving marks on James's pants when he hugged him. "Dad, Grandma Margaret said when these roses grow they'll be the most beautiful in the neighborhood," he exclaimed enthusiastically. James laughed, ruffling his son's hair. "I'm sure they will be, especially with you two taking care of them." Sophie closed her book, carefully marking the page. "I'm going to help Mom in the kitchen," she announced, entering the house. Through the open window, James could see Mary and Harry already working together, preparing the Sunday lunch that had become sacred to all of them. "The whole family together, as it should be," Mrs. Margaret murmured, following his gaze. Mrs. Margaret's house was only 3 streets away from James's house, a deliberate choice that allowed daily visits, but maintained everyone's independence. It was perfect for her. A cozy 2-story house with 3 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen where she loved to cook again, and this garden that had become her sanctuary. The walls were decorated with photos of the new family, nothing from the old life except some memories of her late husband. It was a complete fresh start, and she had embraced every aspect of it. James entered the house to take the ingredients to Mary, passing through the living room where he saw the foundation documents Mrs. Margaret had created. Fresh Start Foundation, dedicated to protecting elderly people from family abuse. He had become co-administrator, using Saturday mornings to help with paperwork and organization. In just 6 months, they had already helped 12 elderly people in similar situations. "We turned our pain into purpose," Mrs. Margaret once said, and that's exactly what it was. The trauma had become mission. "James, can you get the olive oil?" Mary asked from the kitchen. He smiled, entering the environment where the lunch aromas already perfumed the air. The kitchen was the heart of the house, always full of life and movement during Sundays. Mary commanded the space with the efficiency of a conductor, while Harry, now almost 13, had become her dedicated sous chef. "Dad, I'm making the special sauce that Grandma Margaret taught me," Harry said proudly, stirring a pot on the stove. It was touching to see how the children had completely adopted Mrs. Margaret and how she had flourished with their love. Mary approached James, stealing a quick kiss while taking the olive oil. "She's radiant today," she commented quietly. "Did you see?" James nodded, knowing exactly what his wife meant. There were days when the shadow of the past still hung over Mrs. Margaret, especially when she received news about the trial or about Dorothy. But today wasn't one of those days. Today, she was fully present, fully happy. Her grandchildren are coming next week, Mary remembered. It was a delicate but necessary arrangement. Dorothy's children visited Mrs. Margaret bi-weekly, maintaining the family bond. "She's handling it well," James observed, admiring her strength. The house's sound system softly played classical music, one of Mrs. Margaret's passions she had resumed. Everything in her new life was a conscious choice to recover the parts of herself she had almost lost. James returned to the garden to help with the planting, finding Christopher still working diligently under Mrs. Margaret's loving supervision. "You know, Christopher," she was saying, "each plant is like a person. How it needs care, attention, and love to grow strong." Christopher nodded solemnly, absorbing every word. "Is that why some people are bad?" he asked innocently. "Because nobody took care of them properly?" Margaret paused, clearly thinking of Dorothy, before answering carefully. "Sometimes, dear, but some people choose to be bad even having received love. The important thing is that we choose to be good." James approached, sitting beside them on the grass. "And we choose to take care of each other," he added. Christopher smiled brightly. "Like a real family," he exclaimed. Mrs. Margaret and James exchanged an emotional look. "Speaking of family," Mrs. Margaret said after a moment, "I received a letter yesterday." James tensed slightly. Letters usually meant news from the judicial system. "Dorothy wrote," she continued, her voice neutral. James watched her face carefully, looking for signs of distress. Dorothy was serving her sentence in semi-open regime for 3 months, while Frederick remained in closed prison. "What did she say?" he asked gently. "Mrs." Margaret sighed, her hands still working automatically with the plants. "She asked for forgiveness, said she understands if I never want to see her again." Christopher, perceiving the mood change, silently got up and went inside, showing sensitivity beyond his years. "And what do you feel?" James asked. Mrs. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know if I can forgive," she finally admitted. "But I don't want to carry hatred. It's too heavy." James took her hand, offering silent support. "You don't need to decide anything now," he said. She squeezed his hand gratefully. Sophie appeared at the garden door, breaking the heavy moment. "Grandma Margaret, Mom said lunch is almost ready. Do you want me to finish reading the chapter while we wait?" Mrs. Margaret smiled, the shadow passing from her face. "I'd love to, dear." They settled in the garden chairs, Sophie resuming the reading with her clear and expressive voice. James watched them for a moment, marveled at the resilience of the human spirit. Mrs. Margaret had lost so much, but had gained even more. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Must be the nephews," Mrs. Margaret said, referring to Dorothy's children. It was every other week, but sometimes they came off schedule when the aunt taking care of them needed it. James went to answer, mentally preparing himself. The children weren't to blame for what their parents had done, but it was still complicated. Upon opening the door, however, he found a different surprise. "Dr. Smith," he greeted the lawyer. The man was smiling broadly. "James, sorry to show up unannounced on Sunday," the lawyer said, "but I have news that couldn't wait." Mrs. Margaret approached, curious. "What happened?" she asked. The lawyer took an envelope from his pocket. "The mansion sale was finalized. The amount was above expected. We got $7 million. Mrs. Margaret gasped softly. She had decided to sell the property, not wanting any reminders of that place, but hadn't expected so much. "And there's more," the lawyer continued. "With this money, we can significantly expand the foundation. We already have 3 volunteer lawyers wanting to help." Mrs. Margaret's eyes filled with tears of joy. "We'll be able to help so many people," she murmured. James put his arm around her shoulders. "Turning pain into hope," he said. The lawyer handed over the papers. "Congratulations to both of you. You're doing incredible work." After talking a few more minutes, he said goodbye. "Come have lunch," Mrs. Margaret offered, but he politely declined, having a family commitment. Mary appeared at the door, her apron dirty with flour and a smile on her face. "Lunch is ready?" Everyone to the table. It was a small organized rush as everyone headed to the dining room. The table was beautiful, with the crocheted tablecloth Mrs. Margaret had made, flowers from the garden in the center, and places set for 7 people. It was a tradition now. Sunday was Sacred Family Day. Harry helped bring the dishes, proud of his special sauce. Sophie organized the silverware, while Christopher ran to wash his hands still dirty with earth. James helped Mrs. Margaret sit at the head of the table. The place of honor she had initially refused, but everyone insisted was hers. "This house is yours," Mary had said firmly months ago. "You're the matriarch of this family." Now sitting there, surrounded by love and laughter, Mrs. Margaret truly seemed at home. "Before we eat," she said, raising her hand. Everyone stopped, attentive. "I want to give thanks," Mrs. Margaret began, her voice choked with emotion. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over, that I had lost everything. She looked at each face around the table. But I was wrong. I had gained everything. I gained a family that chose me not for what I have, but for who I am. Tears flowed freely down her face now. James, you risked your life for me. Mary, you opened your house and heart. Children, you gave me reason to live again. Christopher got up and ran to hug her, quickly followed by Sophie and Harry. Mary and James joined in, creating a collective hug around Mrs. Margaret. We love you, Sophie said simply. Forever, Harry added. Real family, Christopher declared. Mary kissed the top of Mrs. Margaret's head. You chose us too, she said. James, too emotional to speak, just squeezed Mrs. Margaret's shoulder. When they finally separated from the hug, everyone returned to their places at the table. The afternoon sun came through the window, bathing everything in golden light. James looked around. His family gathered, sharing a simple meal but full of meaning. Mrs. Margaret extended her hand across the table, and James took it. On the other side, Mary did the same, and soon all hands were intertwined in the center, forming a circle of union. This is our family, Mrs. Margaret said firmly, forged by choice and love. Christopher declared solemnly, I promise to protect all of you like Dad protected Grandma Margaret. Sophie added, I'm going to write our story. Harry surprised everyone. I'm going to be a doctor to take care of you all. Mary laughed, kissing each child. You already take care of all of us. When the sun began to set, everyone moved to the garden. Mrs. Margaret in her favorite chair, the children around her, Mary and James standing behind. Each sunset is unique, she said softly, just like each day together. James reflected on the journey to get there. The betrayal had been devastating, but from it something beautiful was born. A true family, a foundation helping other elderly people, a renewed purpose. While the stars appeared, James thought, some families are born of blood, others of love and loyalty. I'm lucky to have found you and be able to call you family. Nothing in the world is more precious than this. There in that modest garden was proof that love always prevails. Now tell me in the comments where you're from and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.